all organisms have to have ways of protecting themselves from pathogens, which are usually microbial in nature, bacteria, viruses, sometimes larger parasites that are trying to attack your body. And we call these defenses the immune system. And all animals have some sort of innate immunity. And innate immunity means you're born with it, and it acts immediately upon infection. And some have an adaptive immunity, specifically vertebrates. And adaptive immunity does not attack immediately upon infection. You have to get exposed to it and then build up your immunity, and then it attacks. Innate is also non-specific. Those types of defenses tend to protect you from multiple different types of pathogens, whereas adaptive immunity, those cells will only fight a specific type of infection. Innate immunity includes things like barrier defenses. So skin is the classic example of a barrier defense. It protects you by keeping foreign pathogens out of your body. But also mucous membranes. In places where you are open to the outside world, like your nose and your mouth and your respiratory system, you're constantly bringing in foreign particles that could be infectious bacteria or viruses, right? And mucous membranes protect you by being sticky and trapping a lot of that stuff, and then we move it up, move that dirty mucus up using cilia, and then we can right get rid of it. But we also have internal innate defenses, things like phagocytic cells that will find bacteria or viruses and eat them up. Antimicrobial proteins, which just kill proteins upon contact. Natural killer cells, which are involved in immune surveillance, meaning they go around and they check your cells to see if they've been infected by a virus or if they're cancerous, and if they are, they'll kill those cells. And the inflammatory response, which causes a localized immune response through dilating of blood vessels and calling of white blood cells to the area. And sometimes things like fever too. All of these are innate, meaning you have them from birth, and they are non-specific, meaning they will protect you from multiple different types of infections, and they respond immediately, right? They're protecting you all the time. Adaptive immunity, again, only found in vertebrates, involves recognition of antigens, which are molecules that you find on the outside of cells. And so, for instance, coronavirus has certain antigens on the outside of the virus. These are, glycoprotein markers. And you may have cells in your body, lymphocytes, that have receptors on them that are the appropriate shape to bind to the antigens on the outside of the coronavirus, or on the outside of H1N1 flu, or a rhinovirus cold, or a bacterium, or whatever it is. And if they bind to that, then they realize you're infected, and then they start copying themselves, and they rally a huge immune response. They make antibodies, and that's really your big time immune response. You save it for when you've actually been infected with something, because it's very expensive. But then you keep a memory, and then if you get infected with the same thing again, you have a much, much faster response. But that's your adaptive immunity, because you adapt to what you're exposed to. And it's specific, and again, includes things like antibodies and cells, which actually will directly kill invading cells like cytotoxic T cells, but only specifically the cells you've just been exposed to. Lysozymes are an example of common antimicrobial molecules. It's an enzyme that breaks down bacterial cell walls, so it doesn't harm us because we don't have cell walls, but it does harm bacteria that may infect us. So we have lysozymes in several places. And then we have a lot of cells that will undergo phagocytosis, meaning they will eat, phago means to eat, cells, cytosis, things like bacteria. A phagocyte will engulf pathogens like these, presumably bacteria, take them in. We have lysosomes full of digestive enzymes that they'll bind with and then break up this bacterium, and then that is that. They're dead. And these non-specific innate defenses are not just found in vertebrates like us, they're found in invertebrates as well. Arthropods, for instance, often have cells called hemocytes, which are their main defense cells, and they can phagocytize other pathogens like bacteria. They also will frequently secrete antimicrobial peptides that break open the plasma membranes of fungi and bacteria that are frequent invaders of arthropods, frequent pathogens. And they have an immune system that will recognize bacteria and fungi by structures on their cell walls. So this works a lot like our immune system does. And we have barrier defenses like the skin and mucous membranes in our respiratory and urinary systems, reproductive tracts. There are also barrier mechanisms in other organisms, again, like arthropods, which have an exoskeleton that helps protect them. We also have a relatively acidic, mildly acidic skin, which prevents bacterial growth. We have dry skin, which also prevents bacterial growth. Our main innate cellular defenses are types of white blood cells, or leukocytes. And there are lots of different types of leukocytes, but a few of the main innate ones are neutrophils, macrophages, dendritic cells, eosinophils. Neutrophils are your most common defender, and they can phagocytize and also destroy pathogens by bringing in a bunch of oxygen and turning it into hydrogen peroxide and essentially exploding and killing a bunch of stuff around them. Macrophages are big phagocytes, as you might expect from the name, found all over the body. Dendritic cells are also types of macrophages. They're big phagocytes found in specific parts of the body in your connective tissue. And you have eosinophils, which protect you from things like parasites. But you don't just need to protect yourself from foreign invaders. Sometimes your cells become dangerous, either because they are virally infected, and so they're essentially zombie cells that are just serving as sites for the reproduction of viruses, or because you've had some sort of DNA mutation and your cells have become cancerous, which also makes them dangerous to you. Either way, you have natural killer cells which circulate throughout your body in something called immune surveillance, and they check on these cells through something called the major histocompatibility complex, MHC, where all your cells display little bits of their own proteins, and these natural killer cells will look to see if they're the right proteins or if they really are viral proteins, or if the proteins are off because you have cancerous DNA. And if that's the case, they will destroy your own cells before they're able to infect more of your body. Your immune system is really tied in with something called your lymphatic system. And your lymphatic system picks up excess fluid from your tissues because you're constantly dropping off more fluid at your tissues via your blood capillaries than you're taking back through your veins. And if this happens continuously, you end up with swelling, and that's not good. And so you have extra sets of vessels and capillaries called lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels that pick up that extra fluid and take it back to your circulatory system. But along the way, they don't just pick up the extra fluid, they pick up all the junk and trash that happens to be in your tissues as well, and whatever pathogens happen to be there. And so they're like the sewer system of your body, right? When we have too much rain, the sewer system takes the excess water and runs it back to the river. But it's not just water, it's all the crap that was on the street, right? And so we have to send it through a factory that will process, a processing plant that cleans all the water before we put it back in the river. And so your lymphatic system does that too through these lymph nodes. You have lymph nodes all over your body, especially in your cervical region, your axillary region, your inguinal region, where your legs meet your trunk. And because they're cleaning things out, they're also where most of your pathogens will wind up, right? And so they're a great place for these white blood cells to go and look for pathogens to protect you. And you have white blood cells in all of your lymphatic organs. So in your small intestines, in your tonsils, in your throat, you have extra patches of lymphatic tissue to help protect you. And again, you have lymph nodes all over the place. And you have a thymus, which secretes hormones that help regulate these processes. Additionally, your cells have their own defenses for viruses. Essentially, when they get infected by a virus, they may not have much of a chance themselves, but they can scream for help using chemicals. So obviously cells can't scream with a voice, but they communicate chemically. So they release what are called interferons. And these are chemicals that warn nearby cells that there are viruses present, right? So if you get attacked on the street, you're probably going to scream. And that scream does two things. One, it warns nearby individuals that there's an attacker on the loose, But 2, it might, call the cops and say, come on over, somebody help me. So interferon warns nearby cells of viral activity, and it also calls macrophages over and says, please come help, destroy these viruses. Our last primary innate response is going to be the inflammatory response. And you're probably relatively familiar with inflammation, right? It has a few cardinal signs: redness, swelling, pain, and warmth. But all of those are a function of extra blood coming to an area. And that's really what inflammation is. You have cells called mast cells and also basophils, which release histamines. And we think of histamines as bad and inflammation as bad, but this is an immune response. Histamines cause dilation of blood vessels. They get bigger and more permeable, and that allows more blood to come. And this causes you to be able to flush out toxins that may be present when there's a bacterial infection. And also it causes more macrophages and neutrophils to come, and they can permeate through that blood vessel, and they can cause an immune response. They can kill whatever is infecting you at that spot. So inflammation can be uncomfortable, but it's sometimes necessary. And at the end, you often end up with a bunch of dead white blood cells along with the dead pathogens, usually neutrophils that have come and have destroyed the bacteria and also died themselves. And you have a bunch of dead white blood cells and bacteria, and that we call pus, right? And it's very gross, but it's a sign that you've been fighting something. So you get hurt, and then you get invaded by bacteria, and then your mast cells will release histamines, which dilate these blood vessels and make them permeable, and more white blood cells are able to come, and neutrophils, and eat up these bacteria and fix you. Now, that causes your skin to get swollen and warm and sometimes causes pain, but this does mean that you're fighting stuff off. Now, sometimes it's inflammation in response to dumb things, right? Allergies are inappropriate inflammation responses. And in that case, you want to keep those histamines from being secreted. So we take antihistamines. And actually, those were invented up the street at the University of Cincinnati. Benadryl was invented by George Revachol at UC, and their biology building to this day is named after him. Now, because our bodies recognize invaders by those antigens, those chemicals on their surfaces, there's an arms race, and they're constantly trying to prevent recognition by modifying those surface proteins, and sometimes that makes them more deadly. So tuberculosis is pretty good at hiding itself, and it kills more than 1 million people globally a year. So while your barriers and chemical processes like inflammation and fever are all innate immune defenses, your adaptive immune defenses include primarily a specific type of white blood cell or leukocyte that's called a lymphocyte. Right? It's a type of leukocyte called a lymphocyte. And there are different types of lymphocytes, but the main groups are T cells and B cells. T cells mature in the thymus, hence the T. B cells mature in the same place that all these cells are born, in the bone marrow. And T and B lymphocytes are specific. As I said earlier, they have an antigen receptor of a specific shape that will only respond to a particular antigen, which is a molecule on the outside of a pathogen. And they will not respond to a pathogen, no matter how deadly it is, if it does not have the antigen that they're looking for. But oh boy, if it does have the antigen that they're looking for, specifically the part of the antigen that they bind to, called an epitope, they will go crazy. They will start multiplying, and they will form lots of themselves, all responding to the same antigen. And they will start producing chemicals to rally the rest of your immune system. And if they're B cells, they will also start making antibodies, which will protect you and help you vanquish whatever your infection is. And we'll talk more about that in the next video.